still be trickling in, but I think in the interest of time here, let's go ahead and get started. Good to see you again. Yeah. Okay, that's great. I'm glad that so many people are showing up to talk about things that that are important, but arguably a bit discouraging. So I'm glad to still see you return. So we had talked the last couple Sundays about Christian nationalism generally, and some of the characteristics about that, and then we talked last Sunday about one specific form of Christian nationalism that emerged and took root in the context of Nazi Germany. And we talked about some of the resistance to that in the form of the Barmen Declaration. And today we're talking about Christian nationalism in the Pacific Northwest, so closer to home. But in many ways, forms of Christian nationalism that, as I think we'll see, have a lot to do with the kinds of things that we're talking about, even the kinds of things that we were talking about last week. So just by way of recap here, the first time we met, we talked about some of these things, some of these characteristics that I suggested to you were some dominant or predominant characteristics of Christian nationalism. First being a fusion of Christian identity and kind of nationalist identity, in which the loyalty to the nation or that nationalist identity is seen as an essential and inevitable part of Christian belonging or Christian living. We also talked about the way in which this new fused identity has claim to our highest loyalty, that it takes precedence over all other loyalties in a person's life. Ways in which this often overlaps with and is supported by or secured by a sense of a racial identity. In ways in which this is really emotionally charged, rather than being driven by evidence or arguments, and which kind of contains an urgent call to action. It's not just a passive identity, but something that drives people towards particular actions. Last week we talked about the way in which this took shape also in Nazi Germany, and we talked about this movement of the German Christians, or Deutsche Christen, with these disturbing symbols that overlay the Nazi swastika with the Christian flag. So I want to continue this today and talk a little bit more about this in our region. As we've done the past few times, we prepared the handouts. This is double-sided. One side talks about the Aryan nations, and the other talks more generally about replacement theory and some more mainstream extensions of this. So while that's going around, I want to tell you a story of a vacation that we took last year, I think it was last year, in Knoxon, Montana. I don't know if anyone's ever been there. This is on the Clark Fork Reservoir. I think you have this right. And it's a beautiful part of the country. It has these beautiful forests and mountains, and the reservoir itself is beautiful. I understand there's a kind of Superfund issue there, and so the fish were really large, but probably not good to eat. We weren't fishing, so okay. We were given a tip by a local of a park that was right on the reservoir, right on the river, and that you could find if you knew where it was, but it didn't have a sign for it. And you had to go down a dirt road for about 1.5 miles, and then you'd reach this park that had these wonderful beaches and was more or less unoccupied at all times. We saw a few other people. And so we frequented there. We had an Airbnb for the week, and we were there most days, and it was beautiful, and I didn't really see any people, and that was part of the charm, of course. But I remember coming back to our vehicle on one of those days, and on the windshield was this flyer that had just this wide variety of deeply anti-Semitic conspiratorial sayings. And this was striking for a number of reasons. First of all, because I hadn't seen anyone else there that day. I had heard some cars kind of coming and going, so it wasn't terribly shocking, but I hadn't actually seen anyone. But beyond that, someone took it upon themselves to want to distribute this literature, let's say, at a park that doesn't have a sign, and saw this as somehow some kind of urgent mission that they had. And I don't know if you've ever seen these kind of pamphlets that are sometimes left around, and you can immediately recognize them as off or crazy before you even read the content. In this case, the content was disturbing, but the fonts were different. It was almost like there's kind of that movie trope of the letter that's made from different cutouts. It was off in a variety of ways, but it had some texts from the Old Testament that were taken out of context. It had texts or quotes from former presidents that were taken out of context. Had sayings from figures I didn't recognize. And it was all disturbing, but it points to something that I think is a feature in some regards of the Pacific Northwest and the inland Northwest, which is that while we have such beautiful countryside, we also have a history of these fairly extremist groups, or extremist views. And there's also a disturbing aspect to this with regard to the Christian community, in that these groups have oftentimes found refuge in Christian churches. So Christian churches haven't always been resisting this or pushing this aside, but in some situations we found instances in which these groups have taken root in the midst of Christian communities, or have had a kind of Christian identity. And this seems to be something that we see cropping up in the Pacific Northwest. So what I've passed around to you is two-sided again. One side gives a short summary of the Aryan nations, which had a compound relatively nearby, just on the other side of the Idaho border. And I invite you to read through that. This is double-sided, so don't worry yet about that next page. And this is a summary that's mainly produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I've made it more concise and condensed. But take a moment to read that through. And after you read it, I'll ask for things that stand out, but also things that connect into some of our conversations so far about other instances of Christian nationalism. All right, I think some of you are still reading with this, which is fine. Anything that surprises you here? Many of you may already be familiar with this history of the Aryan nations in the area. Anything that stands out? And beyond that, any connections you see with what we've talked about in earlier weeks, last time, for example, when we were talking about Christian nationalism in Nazi Germany. Anything that stands out or any connections that stand out? Please.
So these extremists, they're glomming onto the Christian terminology in order to give themselves validity?
Well, this is a good question of what role.
Can you repeat it, please? We can't hear that.
Yeah, so the question was, are these extremist groups attaching themselves to Christian language and Christian terminology in order to give themselves validity? And this is a good question. Is that what's happening? Is there a kind of desire to exploit, so to speak, or make use of Christian language and identity and terminology for the sake of furthering this goal? Or is it something that they're sincere about, so to speak, in the sense that they see those as two sides of the same coin or connected, essentially? But what do we think generally? How does this work? Please.
I think the thing that's interesting to me, when I moved to Spokane, on the way to Deer Park, there was a big sign that was about the John Birch Society in support of it. I was totally shocked.
Right, so
Because you think that those things are historical and gone away, not in this area. And I think we can turn a blind eye and say we're above it, when really we don't understand the many people that are within it.
okay, yeah. So a sign to the John Birch Society nearby, and some of these signs that or things that you run across, like the pamphlet on your car, for example, or, as kind of clues that there are these views that are in the area, and we don't perhaps encounter them that often. You can of course get through a good amount of your life without seeing them, but these are clues that this is around, and it's not as isolated as we would want to believe it is. They're fairly extensive networks. Anyway, please.
Well, I think the interesting thing was when you had mentioned, last week, and you're showing it right there. I mean that there were major, if you compare what's happening in the Pacific Northwest back to what was happening in Germany, this is a subset of that. And so you see that, there's a Nazi symbol because they felt that that was embodying their Christian values of appearance. And you mentioned that, which was really surprising to me, that they had wiped out, they made a new Bible in Germany, where they got rid of all the Old Testament because they just didn't want to have references to Jews and Hebrews. And then more importantly, they said they had some argument that Jesus was, an Aryan,
Yeah.
and that's why he was outcast. He had blue eyes and things like that. So they can rewrite Christianity and then they even got rid of the 10 Commandments and made 12 Commandments.
Right.
And so, I guess you can just rewrite, religion to match whatever your views are and feel good with it.
Yeah, so in that context, in the context of Nazi Germany, Christianity wasn't accidental, so to speak. It wasn't just a peripheral part of it for that group of Christian nationalists that called themselves the German Christians. They really saw there being this integrated identity that brought together their Christian faith on one hand and this Nazi ideology on the other. They wanted to have an understanding of Christianity that was promoting and in line with National Socialism. And likewise, I think in the groups that are in the area here, in certain cases, of course, it might be a more mercenary approach to Christianity, of trying to make use of certain ideas for the sake of getting more traction. But I think for many, it's an integrated, fused identity. These things are together in an essential way. I think people don't necessarily see it as if there's a set of white nationalist or white supremacist beliefs on one hand and then Christianity on the other. I think these things are feeding into one another in the area. There are some other hands here. Please.
I also think the church has a weakness in that they call Sunday morning the most segregated hour of the week, in that we aren't often integrated in our congregations, and therefore you can see how this extremist views if we're not balanced within our churches across differences, having diversity. And I think that came out of kind of the 50s and being a very social institution, the church. And so we like our social groups, and we can move away into the diversity.
Yeah, right. So a weakness is, in a certain sense, when it comes to talking about having awkward, difficult conversations about race and identity and diversity and the things that make it difficult to embrace those kinds of things. We even have honest questions about those things. In certain regards, maybe that presents these opportunities for these other lines of thinking to creep in. Yeah. There's another hand here. Sorry for not keeping track. But others, please.
One of the things that strikes me about Germany and the Pacific Northwest, it's easier probably to take over an existing institution or movement instead of do your own startup, which may help explain why groups like this tend to glom onto a church and infiltrate.
Yeah, I think that's true. So if there was a kind of competing religion, so to speak, it wouldn't have the same kind of legitimacy, or wouldn't have that same kind of pull or range. And this gives a sense of that. It allows people to refer to the nobility and the long-standing value of a particular tradition, and to amplify that way of thinking and that message. Yeah. Others, please.
The whole notion of diversity, not in the Pacific Northwest, but really like Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho, I think, is that we are not diverse because there weren't jobs available for people to come up that were not, educated or, could go into a family business. Whereas like Seattle, you got Boeing and you got other industries. There were jobs here that attracted other, that attracted diversity per se. And, as a result, I grew up, I never saw anything but white bread, and it's not that I was kept from it. It really wasn't around when I grew up in the valley. There weren't that many Black, Hispanic, a few Asian families. That it was very, very, I'm just gonna say white bread, and so it's hard to, then people become held hostage to that viewpoint, that when they see society going awry or things going wrong, they may easily blame the, outsiders for that versus looking inwardly in what's happening to our society as a whole. It's just a matter of the environment per se. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm just saying I had no idea about anything until I went to college.
Yeah, there's of course, it's not just unique to this area that there are these difficulties around the conversations of inclusion and around the kind of fears of those who are different, or fears of those who are seen as foreign or other in some sense. And that's of course playing out nationally, and it's playing out internationally in discussions of immigration. Where I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan too, our churches were very segregated, for lack of a better word. There were a lot of churches. It was not just one church on every church corner, but sometimes two competing with one another. It's kind of a fun joke about Grand Rapids that everyone was kind of competing for the same parishioners that were already going to church. So this is sometimes a situation that arises and takes place, and it's not as if someone has designed it that way. But there are difficult conversations that are hard to have, and we've been slow to have them. And in many ways, maybe this provides inroads for this. Even so, it strikes me that the Pacific Northwest and the Inland Northwest, which, to be clear, I love, is a kind of hotbed for this kind of thinking, and not just white nationalism and white supremacy generally, but also a specific kind of Christian nationalism. Among Christian nationalists, the Pacific Northwest is talked about as the promised land, as the beginning of this kingdom of God, not a spiritual kingdom of God, or not just a spiritual kingdom of God, but also an earthly kingdom that is going to be destined to cover the earth. It's hard to believe, it doesn't seem credible, but these are claims that are being made in this area, not just in this area, but nationally. The Pacific Northwest is held up as a specifically important region in Christian nationalism in the US. It's hard to believe, but it's the case. With regard to the Aryan nations, there's also a really clear overture to National Socialism, right? There's not a case that they were shy about making that connection. They celebrated Hitler's birthday. They tried to model themselves in some sense after the Nazis and after those Christians who embraced Nazism. This is something that we don't often see in the open. So when we see this kind of thing, it's usually in extremist groups that are always on the fringes and easy to dismiss. But in recent years, that kind of admiration of the Nazis has come more to the fore. You see T-shirts that say 6MWE, or 6 million wasn't enough, as a way of... Yeah, these exist. You find people who are openly embracing this, identifying with this. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum recently had to change the way that they organized some of their exhibits because people would come and take selfies with them as a way of trying to identify themselves with what had happened there. So, and Holocaust denial is on the rise, or various arguments that kind of mitigate or try to minimize that is on the rise. These are things that have become more recent in the past few years, but also provided then opportunities for the specific kinds of Christian nationalism that attach themselves to that form of thinking to also step out of the shadows and to enter more mainstream discussions. There's a question bold at the bottom of that page. The Aryan Nations compound in Idaho was shut down. And that means that it's done with, right? The leading question. That's right. So it's that particular group has dissolved. They came up against a number of lawsuits. Part of it had to do with the fact that one of their members attacked a Jewish community center in Los Angeles, I think. And then there was a lawsuit that followed the situation in which a woman and her son were driving near that compound, and I think the car backfired. And then the security detail for Butler, who's the head of that, thought that it was a gunshot, and they harassed them and let you know the lawsuit. And those lawsuits led to the dissolution of the Aryan Nations as an entity. But what's happened with these groups is that they reform as other entities. They generally don't last very long. They have one entity for a while, they break down and they reform as other entities. That's continued. Some of the language has shifted, but these groups have continued. And in recent years, a relatively new phenomenon of this is that they've started to reemerge, so to speak, as religious organizations rather than as political organizations. There are various reasons for that, and I don't understand all the details, but my understanding is that it has in large part to do with the ability to kind of exploit some of the loopholes in Washington law, some tax relief, but also not having to disclose certain things about the organization as a religious organization. And so this continues in various ways. These groups, in addition to just being offensive, had a particular mindset as well that I want to get into, which is called the Christian identity mindset. But also, I want to talk just generally about this compound and where it was. This is Honeysuckle Beach in Hayden, Idaho, which I love. This is a place that we frequent. Those are not my feet in the picture, but I've taken photos that are more or less like that. And it's a nice beach in the way that it's designed, good for small children in particular. Coeur d'Alene, of course, also has a remarkable beach. This is a beautiful area with a wide variety of natural beauty. Here's another instance of us there. This is an area that we frequent, and frequent since we started coming to Spokane. That's one of my punk children. This is my other punk child. I have 3 punk children, actually. Can't remember the name of this beach. I think it was Spirit Lake. I'm feeling nostalgic for the summer. It's passing here. Same lake again. This is a beautiful area, and so I was surprised to learn that this was also nearby in Hayden, Idaho. This is the Aryan Nations compound as it's being demolished. I don't know if you can all see this image, but for those of you who can, what's notable about the roof? That's right. So there's no attempt to hide this identity, right? This is something that's being openly embraced and celebrated. A sense of trying to carry on, so to speak, this Nazi legacy and to tie that to specific forms of Christianity. There was also, though, a wider ideology behind this in the Pacific Northwest, which had to do with a movement in the 80s and 90s, which is still around today, but the language has shifted some, and it's been called the Christian identity movement. Some of the slides that I'm going to show here are actually from other pamphlets that have been left on people's cars or around different places in Spokane. One of my colleagues who is now retired at Gonzaga collected these as she came across them, and so when she retired, she gave about 12 large boxes to the library at Gonzaga, and it's now called the Radicals Collection, appropriately. And it's there, it's open to the public if you're ever interested. It needs to be cataloged. And this gives some of the materials and some of the instruction materials that were part of these movements. You can see here a youth with blonde hair and blue eyes standing over a dragon with a sword that is conquered. This evokes some of the Christian imagery of St. George and the dragon. The Christian warrior kills the dragon being symbolic of Satan or evil in the world more generally. In this case, the youth is wearing a certain uniform and identified in a particular way. And their materials have these very specific teachings about what this Aryan nation is going to look like, what it means to be a part of these groups that identify as Christian identity groups. I won't read all of this, but here are these 12 foundation stones. The first is that we recognize that there exists no place on earth in any branch of the, no place on earth in any branch of the Adamic Aryan race, the state of our own racial nation. meaning that there's not any Aryan state yet on earth. It goes on to talk about the need for the creation of such an Aryan state, and it goes on to talk about the need to have a particular kind of religious law as the foundation, the basis of that, instead of having a kind of constitutional law. Has 12 of these foundational statements. All of them echo this idea that there has to be this foundational racial Aryan nation, but it's also meant to be a Christian Aryan nation. And one of the central ideas of this Christian identity movement has to do with the language of the lost tribes, and the language of the true heritage of Israel. Does anyone know where this is going, incidentally? Has anyone been introduced to this before? So the idea is that there's a teaching of the lost tribes of Israel and a certain connection to white heritage and a connection to what it truly means to be the people of Israel. Has a lot to do with understandings of the relationship between Christianity and Judaism today. But there's discussions of the migrations of the ancient Israelites to the appointed place, or migrations out of the land of Israel elsewhere. And you can see where some of these arrows are going. They tend to go west, and eventually they focus on Great Britain, the reformation of Israel. The idea is that the true Israelites left Israel. They wandered, they migrated, they finally found a home in Great Britain, and then over time, they found a home in the United States. And then over time, they found a home in particular parts of the United States. So that the United States generally, in certain pockets, like the Pacific Northwest or the Inland Northwest, have become these sites of migration or pilgrimage for those who are true Israelites, those who are truly carrying this forward. But what is the identity of this Israel? Notably, it has to do with a certain rereading of these biblical texts. This is difficult to see on the right-hand side, I think, but you can see some of the bullet points on the left. One of them, one of the central ideas is that Adam was white. Adam was not Jewish. Adam and Eve were not the first of all human races, but they were the first of the white race. They were not the first beings created, they were the first white beings created. And that Jews, in fact, are an offspring that is born of an unholy union between Eve and Satan. I think you have that right. I think it was involving Eve. I think in some iterations of it, it's involving another figure named Lilith, but in most that I've seen here, it's Eve. Those who came before are designated as the lower races, or sometimes talked about as mud peoples, in contrast to the true Israelites, who are white. What connections do you see with what we talked about last week, with the Christian nationalism in the Nazi period and the claims about Jesus? Just to draw some connections here. Please.
You have to give up the Old Testament.
Well, right, you've got to say so much of it was wrong or corrupted, right? Or that needs to be read through a specific lens or in a particular kind of code. And that's what happened. There are people who would say, you need to know exactly what's going on kind of behind the text, and you have to know the specific symbols that are hidden, so to speak, in the text in order to make sense of this. In the context of Nazi Germany, there was a claim that Jesus was Aryan, right? That he was a Galilean, and in being a Galilean in those materials, that meant that he was secretly Aryan, that he was blue-haired and blonde-eyed. Excuse me, blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That's right, punk version. And this is an extension to that, right? Where it's connected to the idea that Adam and Eve were right. We're white. I'm really tripping on words here. We're white. They were also Aryan. That this is the true heritage of Israel. Not the Jewish people, not any of the other races, but the whites are able to carry on this true heritage.
I see some connections here with the LDS theory, because there's a lot of blonde hair, blue eye, the belief that Jesus came to North America and was here. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think the connection has to do with the lost tribes of Israel. That there's that language of that the tribes, in some sense, have to do with the establishment of the U.S. as a particularly Christian nation. In parts of the LDS movement, I think you find some echoes of these racial elements. But I think in the mainstream aspect of the LDS movement, they've moved away from that.
Yeah, but I mean, when I worked in Utah,
You run into some of that.
yeah, it's still very much there.
Yeah.
Not in the Salt Lake area, but if you go north, like towards Brigham City, Logan, and south towards, Ephraim and.
Yeah. Right. And so you have these ideas that are kind of on the fringes, so to speak, of Christianity, and are present in this. Again, Great Britain, the US, is the true descendants of Israel. What does this mean for thinking about Jewish people? It means that you tend to make statements like this, suggesting that there wasn't really a Holocaust, that it was overplayed or kind of exaggerated, or maybe didn't happen at all. That the Jews are not, in fact, Israelites, but imposters. That the Germanic kindred, white people, are the true descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, those who are the real anti-Semites, or those who are really anti-Semitic, are in fact the Jews. This kind of strange, roundabout way of thinking. But to be clear, this was a way of thinking that was well established in these communities. So there's lots of teaching material about this. This is really explicit, and it's something that people believe, that informed a lot of their mindset. These kinds of things are hard to read aloud, but they make clear these ways of trying to identify a white racial identity with a Christian identity and a particular kind of national identity. Seeing there is this coming kingdom of God that is going to prioritize and make front and center of dominance of this fused identity. And seeing the Pacific Northwest as ground zero for this. This is something that was taking place. Aryan Victory Prayer, even the font, post-German. This is a feature of some of these Christian nationalist movements in the area. So let me ask before we shift and move on from this a bit. What role does Christianity play in this? And why do you think that this could be tolerated in Christian communities? So what does Christianity do for these movements? We've started to talk about this some already, but please.
I just have a question that hasn't got anything to do with what you just said. But my understanding is that there is no pure white race. It never has been. We originated from Africa. And my understanding is that most of Africa is Negroid or that particular branch of humanity. And so it's really hard for me to get into this bit about, blonde hair, blue eyed.
Right.
I mean, is there such a thing that's pure?
Yeah, it's a good kind of skepticism to have. The language of whiteness, or the language of race, is modern language. It hasn't been around that long. The language of whiteness is fairly modern as well. And for quite a time, of course, people who were German and French and Italian didn't talk about one another with the same labels, right? Those were others. That was the other group. And they didn't identify it in that same kind of way. So there's an artificiality to this language that's made essentially here. Sorry. Please.
Is there an economic element to all of this? As we're going through all this, I keep thinking about Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and how the lower level of white people always want somebody beneath them. And that's where some of the racial things come in.
Yeah, I think this is an argument that's been put forward as a kind of explanation at different times, that these types of views seem to take root among lower socioeconomic classes, or to have more appeal for those who see themselves as excluded from participating in society in other ways. And that seems plausible as an explanation. I think in recent years, though, these types of views have attracted wealthier persons and groups and donors. So I'm not sure. It could be an aspect.
To attempt to engage with your question from earlier, I think that the relationship that Christian faith communities, or just faith-based organizations in general, have with some of these movements, that it makes it easier to ingrain itself within the community and kind of touch base with the lost tribes. It's really easy to associate this solution to a mystery or this solution to a problem with something missing, to insert a common character that follows the same theme as a religious community or an organization, and then take those teachings and engender them, to kind of cherry pick, like you were saying, to eliminate the Old Testament, to cherry pick and choose pieces that kind of link up further with the ideals of this organization, and then to kind of, because from my perspective, people who are in a faith community, they want to do good things for their community and they want to uphold those values. And if someone can come in and corrupt or co-opt those values and start to turn them inward, and then kind of spread that goodness as oppressing the community around them or oppressing members that are outside of that community, to lift them up and bring value, I think potentially that is one quick and easy way to do it, I suppose.
Yeah, so in a certain way, it's easier to understand the motivations of those who would be leaders, so to speak, in these movements, and the appeal, so to speak, of wanting to bring in or be able to incorporate or wanting to be able to claim aspects of that Christian tradition and identity for themselves. I think that's right. What bothers me, and it's a question I want to put to you also, is why this would be appealing for others, for broader members in the Christian community. And maybe putting the question this way, what does your understanding of faith have to look like in order to accept this? Or what is your please.
If people are feeling lost and vulnerable, they need a message, and they hear that it's a Christian message, and they say, "Oh, okay, this could help me. This could make me feel better. This could make me belong, like I belong somewhere." So it's a manipulation of Scripture.
Yeah, so if people are feeling lost and have that kind of resentment, this may seem a validation of it, and may connect parts of their identities that are important to them in a way that seems interesting. Please.
But I think too that something must have been wrong in our churches. People were not finding what they needed in the churches. So along comes somebody like Butler and offers them something better. So it's like, what were we missing? What were we doing wrong?
Yeah.
That these people needed something different and so easily turned there, which I think is happening today. What's missing that turns people the wrong way?
So something about these communities that is not meeting people's needs, perhaps, or not speaking adequately to some of these tensions or challenges, and leaves people or communities vulnerable for this sort of takeover or to be co-opted into these movements. Okay, please.
It seems like, I knew some people that lived in Montana in an area where there were a lot of Amish and Mennonite communities. And just wondering if these Christian identity groups had ever tried to infiltrate those communities. A lot of them don't have, churches in a building. They attend church in their own homes, and they're very Christian, I believe. From what I know.
It's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I'll try to look into it.
They're kind of like, geographically very close.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me as a difference just at the outset is that a number of those communities are have as part of their own identity a kind of need to retreat or pull back from the world for the sake of maintaining their own integrity. And by contrast, the Christian nationalist movements and these Christian identity movements see a sort of urgent call to try to expand and to infiltrate local governments and these things. But it's a good question. I don't know whether this is on. Please.
I lived in Moscow, Idaho in the 1970s and 80s and in Pullman. So over a 15-year period, we actually, at the church I was going to, had some of this Christian identity group show up, and over a period of time tried to especially co-opt the 20-somethings to early 30-somethings. And one of the thoughts about the whole thing is that perhaps if there's Christianity has become cultural rather than theological, and if there's also potentially an element of being anti-intellectual, then you can shift from theology to mythology, which is what this group did. I read some of the books that they recommended, and they talked about the 10 lost tribes ending up in England, and et cetera, et cetera. Now they were in northern Idaho. And it turns history into mythology.
It's a good way to put that. I think that's right. So, and what would happen then is that instead of looking towards relying on historical evidence, the kinds of claims that become more persuasive are claims that will take what would otherwise be seemingly coincidental occurrences in history to make connections, so that there's a kind of mythological coherence that seems persuasive.
It appeals to the gut, not
Right.
to the head.
Right, and this is the way conspiracy theories work too, right? You take coincidences and you make them into something that's more of a coherent narrative, and that has a kind of persuasive feel for many. Yeah, good. If you would, turn over the sheet on the back-end side of this. One of the things I think is an important point to make here is that it's not just the case that there are these kind of fringe groups that have been a part of the region or that we see nationally that have this kind of mindset. What's been happening in recent years is that some of these fringe ideas have started to become more and more mainstream and become ideas that have been voiced on a national stage in one way or another. So locally, the Aryan Nations, I think, is one of the best known of these Christian nationalist groups. In the South, the Ku Klux Klan, I think, is still the dominant historical group that has been a Christian nationalist group. Was very much a Christian nationalist group. I'm trying to put together those views. But these kind of broader fears of losing identity, a broader desire to have a dominant Christian cultural identity have become central concerns that have worked their way into national discussion. They've also shown up a lot in other aspects and instances of violent extremism that we've seen in the past few years. So if you remember in May 2022, which is mentioned in the second paragraph, there was a shooting in Buffalo in which 10 black people were murdered and 3 others injured. It was just at a normal supermarket. 2018, you may remember in Pittsburgh, there was a shooting at a synagogue, the Tree of Life Synagogue. There was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. One of the commonalities of all of this was that the people involved, the perpetrators or some of the participants involved, were really vocal about this idea of replacement and this fear that the Christian cultural heritage was being displaced or threatened, and they wanted to preserve that. At the Unite the Right rally, they marched with torches, which was a Nazi thing to do. They shouted, "Let's party like it's 1933." They shouted, "Jews will not replace us," this kind of slogan that's known to the Nazis. So again, this kind of overt way of trying to make connections and embrace and carry on this legacy of Christians in the Nazi period. But this mainstreaming of these concerns is often now summarized under this term replacement theory, and it has this desire not just to preserve some aspect of Christian heritage or Christian European heritage, but really to promote the dominance of this cultural heritage, and to do so by holding on to this fused identity that brings together a religious aspect, being Christianity, a nationalist aspect, identifying as American, and this racial aspect, as identifying as white. These are things that have become part of the global stage. And there's a lot of overlap between the kind of Christian identity talk and this kind of language. It's a sort of shift in terminology, but many of the ideas are the same. And even if some of the more outlandish ideas that are part of this Christian identity movements aren't always presented in national discussion, still there's a kind of nod to that way of thinking. A nod, for example, to the idea of there being a Christian kingdom, a literal Christian kingdom in this part of the country that is going to be carrying on this white Christian nationalist heritage. And maybe it's not talking about the lost tribes of Israel, maybe it's not making a claim that Adam and Eve were white, but still it's bringing up, so to speak, the less outlandish versions of that line of thinking and bringing them into the public marketplace. And what's more disturbing to me is that it's finding some resonance, that people hear these ideas and they don't fall to them. So there's kind of mainstreaming of this. Patriot Front is a group that has been active in this area in the past few years. This is another of pamphlets that I found on my car, because I got Patriot Front literature. And they bring on, and I think in some cases at least deliberately carry on this Christian identity message. Some of the members attend a local church here in Spokane. They splintered from another group called Vanguard America after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. They were in the news a few years ago for trying to interrupt or disrupt a pride rally in Coeur d'Alene. 31 of their members were arrested at that time. This is the church that some of their members have been linked to, On Fire Ministries. It's just downtown. It's just off the division. Drive past it every day, I realize. Pretty literal interpretations of spiritual warfare. The head figure there, his name is Matt Shea, yeah, that's right. So that's the connection. Carrying on these ideas, in that case, instead of Christian identity, they talk about dominion theology as a way to talk about the need for there to be this dominance, this dominion of a Christian identity on the national stage. There's a tie to the language of Genesis 1:26, in which Adam and Eve are given dominion over the earth, human beings are given dominion over the earth. But in this case, that's taken to be this literal charge to have dominion over earthly governments. But what's notable about this is that in the discussions that are happening in Spokane right now, and probably literally right now on the Sunday morning, there's discussions of setting up this new Christian nationalist kingdom. This new place. This is sometimes referred to as the American Redoubt. The boundaries or the kind of geographical limits of where you see this on maps shift sometimes, but this is one presentation of it. So you have Idaho and Montana, Wyoming, and then the eastern part of Washington and the eastern part of Oregon. And this is viewed as not just in Christian nationalist circles, but also in survivalist circles as a place of refuge as society seems to crumble. You've probably seen in the news, this has not been in the news so much in the last few years, but the proposal for a 51st state, which will be called Liberty, which will just be the eastern part of Washington state, which will have a very conservative focus. Conservative is not really the right word here. A particular kind of extremist conservative focus, and would have a specifically Christian government. And sometimes this is talked about as the unstoppable kingdom in Christian nationalist circles. There being this kingdom that's taking place here. And you find this becoming more and more mainstream. Turning Point USA is a relatively mainstream conservative group. They have in recent years become much more vocal in embracing Christian nationalist figures. Turning Point USA Faith is a kind of smaller subgroup of that and have promoted Christian nationalism. And if you look at their websites, it's kind of sanitized. So there'll be language of the kingdom. There won't be discussion, for example, of Adam and Eve being the true descendants of Israel. But you find a lot of discussion about the need to engage politics, the need to be active in this kind of spiritual warfare. Yeah?
You're mostly talking about white Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that there is also some Christian nationalism in some of the black areas too. Black people, that's not white Christian nationalism, but it's Christian nationalism.
It's true, and the curious aspect of it is that it still kind of echoes some of the language of racial dominance that's associated with the white race, or that is to say, it's still promoting the kind of cultural dominance of the Western Christian identity in that sense. But that's right. You see that sometimes, and it's part of the kind of confusing offshoots of this. But it doesn't seem to challenge the centrality of the white European cultural heritage in it, even where it's being championed. Please.
Clearly, in our society, in the American, church was always an important part. It was a social, as people talked about. But there was this a foundational issue called the separation of church and state,
right,
which is missing here. They do not, the church is this, the state is this, and you don't intermix it whatsoever. And that's, I think, is what's causing some of these issues, is that these Christian nationals are trying to integrate politics, Christianity with government.
Yeah, that's right. So in the Christian identity materials, one of the central tenets, it was on that list of 12 on the slide a while back, is that there needs to be an abolition of that separation of church and state. I think for for many Christian nationalist groups too, there's an insistence that that barrier has to be broken down. And for there to be more of a combination of these things or a fusion of these things. It's an integral part of this that there needs to be this kind of involvement in local government and a kind of political mobilization of this certain kind of Christian nationalist identity. And again, there's a sort of urgency to it. It's not a passive identity. There are discussions of plans in place, and maybe those won't come to anything, and maybe they're unrealistic and incredible and fantastical and all these things. But lots of people are brought into this, and lots of people find it appealing. Please.
So I sense that there's a relationship between this and militias that have been developed all over. In fact, I live actually in Idaho, right on the border, and just 10 miles near Black Rock, there's a road, and you see on the right a huge field with a sign that says militia. And so it's right in my backyard.
Right.
I don't know who they are, but
Interesting.
I think that's scary.
It is. It's scary too. Yeah. So, and the idea that you have that these militias are protection against a corrupt and unchristian government, but also sort of validating that kind of group as having a particular kind of Christian aim. All of this is, I know, very encouraging to talk about. One question I'd like to return to, I suppose, is what does one's faith have to look like to allow for this? What parts of your spirituality have to be truncated, cut off? What parts do you have to say no to allow for something like this to flourish?
Well, the first one is Jesus is Savior.
Okay.
He's the center of our church. So you'd have to give that up because they want the government and they want that strong leadership to be the center.
Right, so one of the things that we saw in the Barman Declaration is this, so responding to Christian nationalism in the context of Nazi Germany is this way of calling out that form of Christian nationalism as a form of idolatry. That's replacing the lordship of Christ with a certain sort of fused identity of a particular Christian government. And that happens, I think, in Christian nationalism more broadly. Yeah, Brent, please.
Well, I think some of them have a lack of actual biblical knowledge, and so it's easy to be twisted, and they use enough Christian terms to distort.
Yeah, so one of the conditions for it is a lack of formation, so to speak, in the Christian tradition heritage, a lack of awareness of what a kind of sound and responsible understanding of Scripture can be, and what that kind of responsible formation of spiritual life might be. I think that's fair. Yeah, please.
One of the things I feel I've seen is an overemphasis on unconditional submission to authority, whether it's in the church or the father figure in the family or the pastor in the church or the church over the government. Authority is a huge issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. Authority is a certain kind of authority, that authoritarian style. That's right. Please.
Loving your neighbor.
All right, yeah, kind of basic aspect of Christianity of having this love for others, this acceptance, operating with mercy and with forgiveness. I think these are basic aspects of it as well. It strikes me too, so I'm bothered by this question. I don't have a good answer for it of why communities, Christian communities, have accepted this, and what about one's faith has to be changed or truncated to allow for this. How it is that these kinds of ideas can be actualized, so to speak, in Christian communities. These things bother me. It strikes me, in some sense, also as a lack of faith, right? That there's a sense in which these kinds of theories are shortcuts for wanting to find a certain kind of Christian community that's going to just, by force, so to speak, make everything the way that someone wants it to be, instead of recognizing the tension and the anxieties that are present, and there are quite a bit of tensions and anxieties that are present, and trying to respond to these with faith. what does this look like to respond to them with faith? What does it mean to do this in an authentic way? These are questions that I'm troubled by, and they're questions that I think will be resolved in faithful, authentic churches, rather than by academics wondering about them.
Well, when it says America needs a strong church, that brings to mind a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And so to me, that is an oxymoron, because I think America needs a caring church.
Okay.
I think that we need to do more of that, more caring of our fellow men and women, because we are diverse. And so it just, this whole topic gives me the shivers.
I think that's good. I think that's very
Also, they've taken all our language. We want the kingdom of God on earth. We pray that every Sunday.
That's right.
There's so much of what we have that they take and say, well, here's your solution. Where we say, there's a mystery to that. I don't know how the kingdom of God is going to happen on earth.
Yeah.
But I don't think you know either, you know? So I just feel they've co-opted Christianity in
Yes,
our deepest
I do.
longings.
Justification.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just glanced at the time and I realized that we're kind of over time here. I want to call your attention to one last thing about this handout, and then say kind of one word parting, and as the segues next week. You have the kind of indented statistics there. Some reports, which are from the Public Religion Research Institute, a survey that was done a few years ago. Among those who identify as white and who agree with various statements, God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians, and immigrants are invading our country to replace their cultural and ethnic background. Took those who agreed with those and also asked them about their willingness or their appetite, so to speak, for political violence. And it was notably higher among those groups. They saw a need to try to bring about this situation by force, to try to validate political violence. So this is another important aspect of Christian nationalism. In its political expressions, it's violence. It's not just trying to take over language, it's trying to really bring about these violent incursions into society. And in that sense, there's a kind of disturbing urgency to it as well. So we are going to take a break from the class next week, and then be meeting here 2 weeks from today. And we'll talk about Christian nationalisms worldwide today, kind of continuing the discussion here. Also talking about instances in Russia and also Hungary, and the ways in which we find Christian nationalism showing up on the kind of world stage. But thanks again for your participation. I really enjoyed these sessions, and glad for the conversation.